When the camera shutter clicked inside the stark walls of Aylesbury jail, it captured the face of a boy who should have been in a schoolyard, not a prison register. George Philby was only 15. His crime was hardly a matter of infamy, 2 stolen fowls, and yet the photograph freezes him at the threshold of a life defined by authority, punishment, and a countryside that offered little mercy to those born at its edges. To the gamekeepers who tracked him, and the magistrates who passed sentence after sentence, he seemed an unruly figure destined for trouble. But the trail of official records left behind tells a more intricate story, one shaped long before his first court appearance, rooted in the rigid expectations and harsh economic structures that governed rural England in the mid-19th century. To understand how a boy from a modest Buckinghamshire lane ended up staring into a prison camera, we must return to the earliest entry written about him. According to the birth register, George arrived on the 10th of January 1857 in Wendover's Swan Lane. His father, Ephraim Philby, earned his living behind a plough, and his mother Sophia, whose maiden name was Penn, worked with her hands as generations of rural women did. Beside Sophia's printed name on the certificate is a simple cross, placed where a signature would normally appear. That quiet mark explains more about her world than any sentence could. Like countless working-class women of the time, she could not write her own name. In that small gesture of ink we glimpse an environment where opportunity was sparse, literacy rare, and long hours of manual effort were the foundation of family survival. Just 4 years later, the 1861 census gives us our next clear view of their household. The Philbys were still in the same cluster of cottages on Swan Lane, a short stretch of workers' homes typical of Buckinghamshire's agricultural towns. Stability in such a place meant consistency, not comfort. A farm labourer like Ephraim lived on seasonal wages that fluctuated constantly, steady in harvest, uncertain in winter, and always insufficient. Sophia's occupation was listed as lace-maker, a common but punishing trade carried out from the cottage window. It required hours of intricate fingerwork for a few meagre pennies. Women stitched into the night, children wound bobbins beside them, and older girls learned patterns as early as they could hold thread. Every pair of hands was part of the household economy. Amid these cramped routines appears young George, aged 4, recorded as a scholar. The word sounds promising, but in 1861 it seldom meant daily lessons or structured learning. Compulsory schooling did not exist. Attendance was irregular, based on what a family could afford and whether fieldwork, lace orders, or household duties required a child's help. Education slipped in between farm tasks, not the other way around. That lone label, scholar, captures the fragile balance of childhood in rural England. Occasional lessons, shared chores, and a family where each person's labour mattered. After that census, the silence of the records breaks abruptly. In June 1869, when George was only 12, his name appears in the court book for the first time. The charge was game trespass, and the sentence swift, 2 months in jail. A childhood divided between Swan Lane and the fields behind it had narrowed suddenly to a cell. To understand the weight of such an offence, we must know what game trespass meant at the time. It was not a notorious crime. Rather, it concerned crossing into privately managed woods or fields where pheasants and other game birds were bred for wealthy landowners' sport. The Game Act of 1831 allowed even minor infractions to be punished harshly. June, the season of nesting birds and fragile eggs, was when gamekeepers were most vigilant. A boy stepping off a footpath, tapping a hedge, or searching for eggs could find himself under arrest before he could explain why he had strayed. For families like the Philbys, living on slim wages and supplemented income, a bird or a clutch of eggs meant a valuable meal or a few extra coins. The boundaries between communal countryside and protected game estates were invisible to hungry children. Those boundaries were defended fiercely by keepers who viewed trespass not as mischief, but as a challenge to the estate's strict hierarchy. In such a landscape, a boy could cross a line he could not see and pay for it with weeks behind bars. By the time the stark prison photograph of 1872 was taken, George had become a regular face in front of the magistrates. The record shows that on the 7th of February, he was again sentenced to 2 months for trespassing in pursuit of game. That autumn, on the 23rd of October, he stood before them 3 times in a single day, once for another trespass, once for using a dog, which signified deliberate poaching rather than accidental wandering, and once for assault. In that era, using a dog was shorthand for active hunting with a lurcher or similar breed, trained to flush birds or chase hares. Each conviction brought with it a 2-month sentence. Only 2 months later came the charge that placed him before the prison camera, the theft of fowls. Foul as it may sound to modern ears, in rural Victorian England the taking of livestock, even small birds, was treated with severity. By 15, George had become a familiar figure to local constables, who viewed him through the narrow lens of repeated offences rather than the broader context of his upbringing. His trajectory widened further in early 1874. In January, he was fined for violating excise regulations, though the details remain vague in the official calendar. Later that year, a news report brings greater clarity. George, by then living in the scattered hamlets of Chesham Parish, was charged with shooting game without the required licence. When summoned to court, he failed to appear, a pattern that soon became one of his evasive tactics, and was fined more than £2, a massive burden for any labourer. By now, the outlines of his life had become unmistakable. He was a youth shaped by poverty, caught in the web of rigid rural law, and increasingly known to authorities who seldom paused to consider the forces that had nudged him into their courts. The records show a cycle: a struggling family, a countryside policed with vigour, a boy seeking birds or eggs, and a legal system eager to make an example of him. And yet, even as the charges multiplied, he was not simply a figure of crime. He was still a son in a small cottage, still part of a household that depended on unstable wages, and still moving through a landscape where opportunity was scarce and temptation close at hand. The year 1876 becomes a turning point, not because George leaves the shadow of the magistrates behind, but because his life begins to fracture in 2 directions at once, one public and punitive, the other private and deeply human. It is in this year that his name appears repeatedly in the court books, each entry marking another step into the world of crime that had begun claiming him in childhood. On the 7th of May, a farmer from Wendover, Alfred Runce, reported hearing the sharp strike of an axe somewhere along his hedgerow. The hedge in question lay far from any recognised footpath, and when he followed the sound, he found George crouched in a ditch, an axe at his side and a gap freshly chopped through the fence. A constable who was called to the scene emphasised that this was not an isolated incident, noting that George had been before the local magistrates only weeks earlier for digging out rabbits. The court sentenced him for the damage, a reminder of how quickly small infractions accumulated into months behind bars. Just 2 days later, on the 9th of May, another keeper, this time on the Rothschild estate at Holton, found 4 partridge eggs in George's possession. It was nesting season, and estate keepers were vigilant, patrolling the land with a zeal that often blurred the line between protection and persecution. Taking eggs was a petty act, yet in the eyes of landowners, it was an attack on their sport and an affront to their authority. When both of these cases came before the bench later that month, George received a month's imprisonment for the hedge damage and a fine for the eggs. Whether he served both terms is unclear. Fines often provided an escape from longer custodial sentences, but the financial strain such penalties caused could haunt a labourer's family just as deeply as a prison stay. And still, life continued. Amidst this cycle of accusation, punishment and fleeting freedom, George made a decision that seems almost incongruous. On the 5th of August 1876, he stood with a young woman named Mary Ann Mortimer in a Wendover church, and the two were married. Both were 19. The marriage register confirms that George listed his father as Ephraim, the ploughman who had worked fields long before his son knew what a trespass charge was. For a moment, the record offers a still point, a sign that despite the mounting trouble, George was trying to form a household of his own, but the countryside and its keepers had not finished with him. The following spring, in May 1877, George faced yet another charge of trespassing in search of game. This time, he and a man named James Atkins were sentenced in their absence, an avoidance tactic George was increasingly adopting. Days later, he was seen again in Baldwin's Wood, spotted by keeper Peter Fountain. As George bolted, Fountain shouted after him using the nickname Dickie Bird. That offhand cry would later prove unexpectedly significant, linking George's reputation in the fields with the criminal title recorded officially years later. Throughout 1878 and 1879, George's name continued to fill the court ledgers. He was charged with violating game laws, with damaging property, and with other small-scale offences tied to the relentless battle between rural labourers seeking a meal and landowners determined to preserve their game stock. Sentences range from 3 weeks to 2 months, interspersed with fines he could rarely afford. Even so, one detail begins to surface repeatedly. George was no longer merely slipping into woods. He was evading authorities more deliberately, using false names, bribing witnesses with coins or small gifts, and showing signs of an emboldened and cornered man. By 1879, the conflict turned physical. On the 9th of April, George pleaded guilty to assaulting a ploughboy named Samuel Freeman. It was a brief case, with the court imposing only a fine, but it hinted at a shift. The tensions between George and the rural world around him were escalating. A mere 2 days later, he was accused of killing a partridge. When confronted by the keeper, he gave a false name, prompting the magistrates to adjourn the matter. This act of deception was a telling sign of how deeply his criminal record had come to shape his every decision. Newspapers of the period add further texture to these years. In June 1879, an article describes George and several others caught digging for rabbits with a ferret in Jenkins Wood. When discovered, he attempted to buy the silence of a witness with 2 pence, a small bribe that underscored his desperation rather than any hint of cunning. In October, he was found with the Fountain brothers in Cinderbottom Wood, his pockets bulging with game. The court, perhaps weary of seeing his face, referred to him as an old offender, and issued a substantial fine or 2 months in custody. By November, Alfred Rance had brought him to court yet again for trespassing in Mercer's Wood, a sign of how tightly the local community policed its boundaries and how little room men like George had to manoeuvre. As the 1880s dawned, the pattern did not ease. In December 1880, he was discovered setting wire snares for hares on the Rothschild estate. By February 1881, he was caught digging for rabbits at Lee Common with a mattock, and in June of the same year, he threatened Alfred Rance once more, this time while carrying a firearm. The courts were appalled. George admitted openly that he had been released from prison earlier that same day for a previous threat against Rance. Unable to post the sureties required to keep the peace, he was returned immediately to custody. These confrontations make clear that the dynamic between George and the estate keepers had become a simmering feud, each encounter layering resentment atop hardship. Soon after, another significant document appears, an entry in the Habitual Criminals Register. This official compilation was used to track those the authorities considered repeat offenders, and here George's alias, Dickie Bird, was formally recorded for the first time. The register also provides a rare description of him: 5 feet 2 inches tall, with a fresh complexion, dark brown hair, and blue eyes. The details are sparse, but they render him suddenly vivid. A small, sharp-featured young man whose world had shrunk to the space between prison walls, hedgerow shadows, and the narrow lanes where keepers knew his name. By the early 1880s, his offences were expanding beyond poaching. The next major case would draw him deeper into conflict with the law, revealing both the recklessness of his actions and the frayed remains of his personal life. By the spring of 1882, George's story took on a darker shape. The petty trespasses of his youth had evolved into something far more serious, acts that hinted at planning, desperation, and a willingness to push beyond the boundaries he once merely brushed up against. The authorities, already weary of his repeated appearances, now viewed him not as a mischievous rural boy, but as a persistent threat to the order of the estates that dominated Buckinghamshire life. On the 1st of April 1882, at the Aylesbury Petty Sessions, George faced a charge that suggested intent rather than impulse, being found in a field with the clear purpose of committing a felony. The complainants were 2 brothers, Samuel and Walter Punter, who bred pheasants for the shooting season. It was Walter who recalled the night with uncomfortable clarity. Close to 10 o'clock, he had been walking near the pens at Lee Common when he spotted a shape lying motionless in the grass. George, only 15 yards from the birds. A convenient opening had been cut in the hedge beside him, an unmistakable sign that entry had not been accidental. Walter approached cautiously, and George pretended to be asleep, hoping perhaps that the ruse might spare him arrest. When shaken awake, he sprang to his feet and issued threats in the dark. But one detail in the report stood out with chilling sharpness. As Walter guided him away from the pens, George lifted his head and whistled, several times into the night. Moments later, someone, or more than one person, whistled back. The answering call revealed that George had not been acting alone. What had begun in childhood as solitary trespass had hardened into coordinated poaching, an activity often carried out in groups under cover of night. It was the kind of operation estate owners feared most. Yet beneath this escalation lay a quieter tragedy. The newspaper article noted that George's wife was living apart from him, staying with her parents in Bollinger. Whether the separation stemmed from financial ruin caused by his many fines, or from the exhaustion of trying to build a home with a man rarely free from custody, the result was the same. George's family life was coming undone. When questioned later by the police, he stated bluntly that he had no home to go to, a declaration not of bravado, but of deep instability. That admission, spoken in the cold light of the courtroom, shows a man whose choices had finally caught up with his private world. To understand the strain on his family, we look back to the census of 1881. Here, a revealing picture emerges. His wife, Mary Ann, then only 23, was not with her own parents as the article had implied. Instead, she was living with George's aging parents, Ephraim and Sophia, back on Swan Lane, the same cottages where George himself had been a child. Listed with her are two small boys, Ernest 4 years old and George Arnold just 2. Beside Mary Ann's name, the enumerator recorded her occupation as straw platter, a trade requiring long hours of weaving straw into braids to be sold to hat manufacturers. The pay was low, the work relentless, and the responsibility heavy. The census page makes one truth painfully clear. While George was in and out of prison, the burden of survival fell onto the shoulders of his parents and his young wife. They formed a fragile shelter around the children he could not provide for. The courts did not share this perspective. In 1883, George was charged with receiving 16 tame pheasants valued at £8, a significant sum. He was convicted and sentenced to 9 months in Aylesbury prison. For a man already struggling, the sentence deepened the chasm between him and the life he had once tried to build. Any chance of stability with Mary Ann grew fainter. It was shortly after this release, in January 1884, that George encountered the law again. This time, he was arrested for breaking into the home of a local justice of the peace in Northchurch. The theft was small, a box and a handful of other items, but the location made it a serious offence. The court sentenced him to 3 months of hard labour, further cementing his reputation as a habitual offender. Then came the case that defined the peak of his criminal record. During the midsummer quarter sessions of 1884, George Philby, now 28, was tried for stealing a basket containing nearly 200 pheasant eggs at Northchurch. This was not the act of a lone hungry labourer, but a theft on a scale that threatened estate operations. The court, in its judgment, highlighted 16 of his past convictions, beginning with his first charge in 1869. The list served as a ledger of his life, a tally of trespasses, fines, imprisonments, and confrontations stretching across 15 years. Found guilty after a previous conviction, he was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. A sentence of such length marked a brutal chapter. 2 years in the Victorian penal system meant back-breaking labour, cramped cells, diet restrictions, and constant surveillance. For someone as slight in stature as George, 5 feet 2, with a build more suited to farm work than prison yards, the punishment would have taken a severe physical toll. When he emerged, the tone of his story seemed to shift. The records fall quiet for a time, and the next glimpse of him comes not from a courtroom but from a household entry in 1891. After years of separation, George and Mary Ann were once again living under the same roof. The census lists him as the head of a home in Chartridge, with Mary Ann beside him and 2 of their children, George Jr. and Mary, recorded as part of the family. He was still working as an agricultural labourer, but the picture suggests an attempt at reconciliation, a fragile, hard-won return to domestic life. It is easy to imagine what that must have required from both husband and wife. The wounds of years of instability do not heal quickly, yet the desire to rebuild seems evident. For the first time in decades, the official record shows George not in a dock or a cell, but at the head of his family table. It is a brief window of peace, a small pause in an otherwise turbulent existence. But peace, for George, was never permanent. The next storm was already gathering. His final entries in the criminal registers were still to come, marking an end not with redemption, but with the quiet, exhausted persistence of a man who could never fully escape the shadow of the laws that had shaped his life since boyhood. The calm that briefly settled over George's life in the early 1890s was never destined to endure. Though he and Mary Ann appeared at last to share a stable home, the criminal record that had defined his youth and early adulthood still clung to him. The countryside he lived in was changing, estates tightening their control, keepers more vigilant than ever, and local magistrates keen to impose firm sentences on familiar names. It was within this climate that the final chapters of George's troubled history unfolded. The next official entry comes from the Habitual Criminals Register in the late 1890s. By then, the authorities had grown used to tracking men like George, whose names threaded through decades of court calendars. The register adds only a short note. In October 1899, George was convicted once again of larceny and sentenced to 9 months. The record does not linger on the details of the crime. Instead, it compresses the moment into a single line, as if the clerks had come to expect such news from him. For George, now in his early 40s, the sentence must have felt like a familiar return to a life he had attempted to leave behind. When he next appeared before the court, it was May 1902. He was charged with another incident of game trespass, an offence that by now had become almost synonymous with his name. But this time, the prosecution presented something that underscored just how deeply the pattern had taken hold. They laid before the magistrates a staggering list of 19 previous convictions. To see such a record laid bare would have been devastating. Each entry represented not only an offence but also time lost, weeks and months stripped away from family, from labour, from any hope of a consistent life. The sentence that followed was firm, and by the time he completed it, George was a man approaching the end of middle age. After that case, the familiar echo of his name vanished from Buckinghamshire entirely. No further court appearances, no local news reports, no prison admissions. It was as if he had stepped out of the county that had watched him grow from a boy gathering eggs in hedgerows into a man locked repeatedly behind bars. When the trail finally reappears, it leads not to the Chiltern Hills but to the heavy industrial valleys of South Wales. The 1911 census places George, Mary Ann, and several of their surviving children in the mining town of Blaina, at 29 Rifle Green, a world utterly unlike the rural lanes of Wendover. The soot, the clang of metal, the deep shafts cutting into the Welsh earth. These were the landscapes that consumed the men who lived there. Many families migrated to Wales during this period, drawn by the promise of steadier wages in coal mines than the uncertain earnings of farm labour. For George, leaving Buckinghamshire may have been the only way to sever the ties that had bound him to a lifetime of conflict with keepers and courts. In Wales, he was a stranger, one man among hundreds who woke before dawn to the sound of pit whistles. But the census reveals something even more striking. Under Mary Ann's details, the enumerator recorded that she had borne 11 children, yet only 8 were still alive. 3 had died. The language is clinical, but the sorrow behind it is unmistakable. Infant mortality was tragically common in working-class families, but each loss would have carried its own weight. These were years of hardship, made heavier by the instability that marked the early part of their marriage, and yet Mary Ann endured, working, raising children, relocating across the country when necessary, holding the fragments of family life together even when her husband could not. For George, the move to Wales seems to have marked the closing act of his long conflict with the law. No further charges appear after 1902. Whether because he had grown tired of the struggle, or because the industrial landscape offered fewer of the temptations that had defined his youth, the decades-long tug-of-war with rural authorities finally came to an end. He became, at last, what the census described him as, a labourer living quietly with his wife and children. The last entry in his story comes from the burial register of Blaina. On the 26th of February 1919, George Philby, recorded simply as a 62-year-old labourer, was laid to rest in the mining town he had made his final home. There is no grand eulogy, no glowing obituary, only the silent confirmation of a life concluded far from the fields where it began. His journey, marked by defiance, poverty, punishment, and perseverance, ended in a place where the land itself bore the scars of human struggle. Looking back, his life tells more than the story of one man. It holds within it the tensions of a rural society where landowners held power, where poverty pressed families into impossible choices, and where boys like George walked a thin line between survival and the law. The succession of convictions, trespasses, petty thefts, confrontations was not simply the tale of a young troublemaker, but a reflection of the economic constraints that shaped countless working-class youths. In a landscape where game laws were tightened to protect the leisure of the wealthy, a single pheasant or a clutch of eggs meant more to a poor family than it ever could to an estate owner. George's criminal record also reveals a more intimate story, the pressure placed on his wife, who worked tirelessly as a straw plater and later a homemaker in a foreign valley, the grandparents who sheltered her and the children during George's imprisonments, the quiet reconciliations that must have taken place in the gaps between his sentences. His life was not simply a string of offences, it was a family trying again and again to hold itself together, and when he finally left Buckinghamshire behind, he also left behind the world that had shaped his conflict. His sons grew up not in the gently rolling farmlands, but in the iron-bound mining communities of Wales, where danger came not from keepers in the woods, but from collapsing tunnels and coal dust that stained every breath. The Philbys, once a family of agricultural labourers, became part of a new industrial Britain, their future carved in the black seams beneath the hills. In the end, the boy captured in the Aylesbury prison photograph lived a life both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in its poverty, its struggle, its movement from one form of labour to another. Extraordinary in its resilience, in the sheer endurance required to navigate a system stacked against him from childhood. His story reveals the unseen battles fought at the margins of Victorian society, battles not just against the law, but against hunger, class and circumstance. This is where his narrative closes, not with a headline, but with a quiet burial in a Welsh mining town, far from the hedgerows where it all began. His journey stands as a window into a world now long vanished, a world of rigid boundaries, fragile livelihoods, and lives lived at the mercy of forces far larger than the individuals caught within them.